Joining us on the line is ERICH Pratt. He's Senior Vice President of Gun Owners in America. In addition to authoring Bearing Arms, Our Rights, Our Duties, and Our Freedoms, he's the author of a civil government textbook, The Constitutional Recipe for Freedom. ERICH, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Great to be with you.
So let's talk about this very important Supreme Court case. So the Supreme Court has now taken up a case with regard to whether, in fact, you have a right to bear arms outside of your home. It seems perfectly obvious from the simple language of the Second Amendment that you should be able to, bear arms, considering that is the exact language of the Second Amendment, that it's not enough to just be able to, quote unquote, keep arms. It says keep and bear. What exactly is this case, and what impact would it have on national gun laws?
Well, this case is huge because all across the country, lower courts have wanted to ignore the fact that the Second Amendment guarantees a right to keep and bear arms, as you were just pointing out. Now, the Supreme Court smacked down those lower courts in 2008, ruled that this right is an individual right. And 2 years later, the court said that state and local governments can't infringe this right that individuals have. And so that was all great, right? Well, unfortunately, since then, lower courts have almost universally ignored the major holdings in those two decisions. And I should say, so have corrupt jurisdictions like New York City. I mean, you can be a good person who doesn't even have a speeding ticket to your name, but New York City can still deny your right to protect yourself for no reason at all. One of the plaintiffs in this case saw his home broken into several times, and yet the city still said, nope, you don't have a special need for self-protection. I mean, it's just incredible. You shouldn't have to prove that your name is John Wick and that you have a whole team of gangsters who are trying to kill you before you can get a permit. And see, this is the double standard that comes in. If your name is Howard Stern, or you're a famous sports star, you can get a permit in the city. If you're rich and you can lavish the officer approving your application with vacations, prostitutes, or cash. I mean, that's a real thing, by the way, in New York City. Then you can get a permit. This system is the ultimate in corruption and double standards. And quite frankly, it turns the Bill of Rights on its head because our rights come from God, not from the government. So we shouldn't have to beg a bureaucrat to allow us to exercise our Second Amendment rights any more than you, Ben, should have to get government permission under the First Amendment to broadcast a show on YouTube or anywhere else. And so really, that's why this case is important, because like New York, there are 7 other states that frequently refuse to let people carry guns, and this case can put an end to that.
Yeah, Eric, I think that a lot of people don't even understand how restrictive a lot of these gun laws are. I used to live in Los Angeles County, and when I was in LA County, I applied for a CCW, and I did that on the basis of the inordinate number of death threats I had received. I based it on the fact that the FBI had actually arrested somebody for threatening to come to my house. They arrested him. He had weapons ready. He had body armor ready. And I went to the LAPD and I put in my application, and the application was rejected on the basis that the FBI had actually arrested the guy. So in other words, because the FBI got that one, there were no other problems. And so simply I should respond to everything by calling the police, who, by the way, are also the bad guys. The sort of bizarre, counterintuitive and conflicting ideas that are put out by the left on this stuff are pretty amazing. The police are bad. Also, only the police should have guns, and you shouldn't have a gun. But if the police show up and they shoot somebody attempting to break into your house, they're racist. I don't understand how any of this fits together on a policy level.
Well, it makes no sense. And, as you've pointed out, this is not just a New York City problem. I mean, these double standards and the way gun control has been applied in a discriminatory fashion, guns for me and not for thee, is really an age-old problem. I mean, let's not forget Martin Luther King Jr. After his home was bombed, he wanted to get a concealed carry permit in 1956, and he was denied, not because of anything in his record, but because of who he was. It was being applied very discriminatory fashion. Florida, around that same time, there was a judge talking about their permit to carry law, and he said, I know something of the history of this law. The statute was never intended to be applied to the white population, and in practice has never been so applied. You see, in some places, permits have been used to keep the minority from exercising their rights, or those who, as I was saying earlier, aren't the rich and famous. And this is the ugly face of gun control that doesn't often get talked about, certainly not in the mainstream media, but it's always been applied in a discriminatory way. The gun's for me and not for thee. And again, that's why this case is such an exciting case.
So, Eric, when you look at this, the constituency of the Supreme Court at this point, it looks pretty good for gun owners here. It wouldn't have looked quite as good if Amy Coney Barrett weren't on the court at this point. But it takes 4 justices to determine whether to take up a writ of certiorari here. So 4 justices have said that they want to take up the case, which suggests at least 4 votes in favor of the Second Amendment here. Where do you think this case comes down? It seems to me that the swing vote here is probably Gorsuch, because it seems like Alito, Thomas, Barrett, and maybe Kavanaugh would all be on the side of the Second Amendment here. I think Gorsuch might be too. Roberts, at that point, becomes an afterthought.
Yeah, I wouldn't count on Roberts. I think we have a 5-4 majority. Gorsuch has actually been solid in the past on gun cases, Second Amendment cases. So we feel very confident about this. And quite frankly, I think the fact that anti-gun legislators across the country are very worried about the Supreme Court taking up the case is as good a sign as any. That this case, I mean, you can never count your chickens before they're hatched, as they say, but I feel very good about this. And again, you know, a win at the Supreme Court would mean that the 8 states, which are may issue states, and California is one of them, you were just talking about that, you know, where your right to carry can be ignored by government bureaucrats, it would mean that their laws could be totally invalidated. And when that happens, that's going to be a great win for honest gun owners. And you know what? I think it'll also wipe the smug smile off the faces of people like New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. I mean, the gall of Cuomo to say that this court case that we're talking about here, by allowing people to carry guns, threatens the security of people. You know, the governor talking about being worried about people's security. This is the very guy who put COVID patients into nursing homes, right, resulting in the deaths of thousands of people. Now he's lecturing us about security. You know, you just can't make this stuff up. But again, a win at the Supreme Court, one outcome would be that, you know, there's going to be tremendous weeping and gnashing of teeth among the anti-gun Cuomos of the world. But the truth is, people like you and me and others are going to be a whole lot safer, because people die when they're prevented from protecting themselves. And sadly, there's been actually too many cases of that around the country.
So, Eric, you know, do you think that there's a chance here that the Supreme Court tries to draw some sort of other arbitrary line? Because the most obvious line here is that you have the right to keep and bear arms. That means that you basically should have the unrestricted ability to simply carry a gun so long as you've gone through a federal background check and done all the things that the Supreme Court has already sort of greenlit in terms of regulations here. Do you think that they instead try to draw some sort of middle line where they say certain regulations are okay on CCWs, certain regulations are not okay? Because there's basically 3 levels in the United States, correct? There are ones where they're the unregulated states, they're the you may carry states, and then they're the states where they basically say that you have to have like a specific permit and go through a giant hoop jumping process in order to carry.
You know, that's always a danger when you're dealing with the courts. And even the Heller decision had like half a page, even just a couple sentences that were troublesome. But you know, what we always argue, and by the way, Gun Owners of America, we're going to have an amicus brief in this. And when we had our amicus brief in for the Heller case back in 2008, USA Today interviewed us because they said amongst all the briefs that were that had been submitted, ours was unique in this way. We were the only one that was arguing that the language of the Second Amendment, which says the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed, that invalidated all these restrictions. And we're going to be arguing that again, that, you know, really, you know, the courts love to get into the, you know, strict scrutiny versus intermediate scrutiny. And we argue that they shouldn't be applying any level of scrutiny, because the Second Amendment has its own standard, and it's shall not be infringed. And when they apply that standard, then you get rid of all the discrimination, all the bias in the way that gun control is applied. And by the way, you also have people who are then able to save their lives because they're able to use firearms effectively in their own self-defense.
It's Eric Pratt, Senior Vice President of Gun Owners of America. Eric, really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Ben.